Okay, hello everyone. So to introduce myself, I'm Daniel Mutanda. I'm a predoctoral fellow at the School for Public Health Research based at the University of Exeter, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dawn Mannay. So Dawn is Professor of Creative Research Methodologies at Cardiff University. Dawn has interests in education, inequalities, identities, and children and young people. In relation to creative approaches, Dawn authored the book Visual, Narrative, and Creative Research Methods. She co-authored Creative Research Methods in Education with Helen Clara, Narelle Lemon, and Megan McPherson. She also co-edited the Sage Handbook of Visual Research Methods with Luke Powles and the Handbook of Creative Data Analysis with Helen Clara and Ali Roy. Dawn is committed to working creatively with communities to produce multimodal data and disseminate the messages from research findings in an innovative and accessible way to increase the potential for social, educational, and policy change in support of informed practice. So Dawn, over to you.
Thanks, Danielle. So that's sort of me, and I'm going to talk through some creative approaches. So first of all, thanks to Chloe for inviting me, and thanks to Daniel for facilitating today, and thanks for Susan for helping me set up the tech. So hopefully it'll all run smoothly. And thanks also everyone for coming along, and I hope you'll find it interesting. So I'm going to talk through some visual and creative approaches, thinking about found, researcher-initiated and participatory productions, think through the issue of familiarity, different examples of creative data generation, talk a little bit about ethical practice, then dissemination and impact, and then we'll have some time for questions. So Luke Powles offers this sort of framework for grouping and sorting different visual approaches. So he thinks about found materials, where we're the sort of image collectors, and those materials are out in the world for us to find and curate and analyse. And then research initiated, when we create things ourselves. And then participatory projections, where the social scientist there is seen more of a facilitator to help and assist participants to tell stories about their lives in their own way. But there's sort of blurred lines between these three categories, and they overlap. And today I'm going to focus mostly around participatory projections and creating data with participants. So in terms of found materials, so we're surrounded by visual materials. They're everywhere we look. They're on phone screens and on our laptops and on our televisions and on billboards and newspapers, and they're on the food we eat and the products we buy. So we're just surrounded by all of these images all the time, and art and heritage. And they all have their own stories to tell, and they make us think about the world in different ways, and also represent different people and different communities. So there's been this sort of idea that some things are just in the background, such as, sort of culture and arts, and we walk past these statues and don't know who they are. But all these things aren't benign, as we've seen more recently. So in Bristol, we saw the Edward Colston statue being destroyed, and then the Jen Reid statue coming up. In Wales, in the museum, we've seen the Thomas Picton painting come down. So quite a lot of sort of issues that the people involved in this had to face. So this was part of a project with young people in the museum, and it was replaced by this sort of new image. But there was a lot of sort of argument back that these things should stay, and this is our narrative. So even though we might walk past a lot of statues and not always know who they are, they do have a place to play, and they do say something about our culture. So all those ubiquitous images that surround us play a part in how we think about ourselves, how we think about others. And we can think about this as well with sort of public health images. So there's lots of different public health campaigns, and they use a range of images to try and get their messages across. There's also health magazines that often sell ideas about the idealized body, or there are health supplements that tell us how we should look. And if we just take a magic pill, this could be our life. So we know that a lot of advertising doesn't give what it promises. So we know that if we buy the expensive shampoo, we won't become a celebrity, but we still get drawn into these things. So the visual draws us in. And the visual can be dangerous because it can provide accurate sort of representations of communities and their lives, but also and often misrepresentations and stigmatized forms. So there needs to be a sort of awareness of images. And often when we do research, we will look at what's published in text, in academic literature or grey literature, but often not look at the images that surround the issue or the communities that we work with. But those images do play a part in how we think about things. So it's important to have an awareness of images. And when we want to use images, not just to research them and see what those pictures are and how they represent people, but also to present our findings, we want to be thinking about providing solutions, providing information, but avoiding stigmatizing the communities that we want to work with in our research. So moving on from found images to researcher initiated. So there's a whole tradition of documentary photography, and the picture there is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. And also work like Douglas Harper's Visual Sociology, where the researcher acts as a photographer to capture aspects of the world around them. There are also art-based projects. Rosie Cannon's recently done her PhD, where she included postcards between the different characters, but sort of carefully curated those, thinking about the time, the decades that they would have been written, the stylization of those, and how they could give sort of deeper insights into the relationships between the characters in her work. There's also ethnographic art, where people might tell their own stories. So Jason's done a lot of work around depression and what it's like to experience that. How can you visualize that for other people? Even if we think that we're not particularly creative and we don't use any visuals or creative products, we probably do use maps or diagrams or charts within our publications and our work. Mona's done some lovely work with comics, thinking about medical practice and how practitioners work in their everyday lives. And recently, I've written a book with Vicky Timperley on sandboxing, and we used sandboxing to think about what we wanted the book to be. So you can also create visual data or work creatively to plan projects. And then, importantly, dissemination and impact. So I'll return to that later, but that has an important part to play about how we don't just have sort of inaccessible articles or dusty theses that no one will read, how we can use the visual to engage people and change and inform policy and practice. And then we come to participatory projections. So this is often about research with and not on participants. So it's moving away from that sort of idea of the sort of white-coated experimenter who collects information from research subjects, but rather we work with people and communities to try and understand their subjective perspectives. So often here it's about working side by side, handing back the camera, so that instead of the researcher being in control of what's produced, participants can get involved with mapping, collages, drawing, plasticine, filmmaking, and present their everyday lived realities. So participatory approaches often are interested in engendering a space for empathy rather than sympathy. So it's not about feeling sorry for people, it's about trying to understand their lived experiences. Participatory approaches or participatory research is quite a wide umbrella, but often it's partially participatory. So what we see in a lot of studies, my own included, is that it's sort of participatory in the middle. So communities might be involved in producing data, but they're not often involved in the design of the project, the analysis, the dissemination. So often that's partial, and it's sometimes difficult to engage people at the beginning, but then you can have a holistically participatory approach where you do design projects with participants, they are involved in the analysis and they are involved in the dissemination. Importantly as well, arts-based doesn't equal participatory. So even though you've got a lot of creative materials and participants might make things, it's how the project's set up and your relationship with the participants that makes it participatory rather than sort of having some pens and crayons. So let's switch now to talk about this because this is why I really got interested in creative research because of the problem of familiarity. So when you're studying in an area you know, it's very difficult to see anything that isn't just there. So Greer talks back in 1964 about, you know, how do you go back into college and study undergraduates when you've sort of been there before? So you might be doing observations and everything you write in the notepad is sort of, yeah, normal, usual, seen it all before. And so this desire to make the familiar strange is a really important element of research. So how do you see things anew? How do you leave your own memories and assumptions behind? So people have tried to fight familiarity in different ways. So in educational research, rather than looking at processes within the classroom, people like E.J. Reynolds and Thorne went out in the playground to look at relationships. Sarah Delamont and Paul Atkinson have done lots and lots of different works. So they're educational researchers. But to study education without having this over familiarity, they've moved from classrooms or universities or colleges to study spaces they know nothing about. So they've studied capoeira, they've studied glass blowing, they've studied medical education. So when you can see those educational processes in a system that you're not familiar with, you can learn new things. In the same way, the visual can be a way to try and fight familiarity and provide different ways of knowing and understanding. So the visual can help the researcher and participants sort of slow down in that making process, reflect on their lives, quieten the voice of the researcher. So art can be a way to overcome the confines of language and make the familiar strange. So that was really useful for me back when I was doing my PhD because I was working in a community that I knew very well. And I had done interviews there before. And what happens is then I think I know everything about the area, and then the participants think I know everything. So they would start saying something, and I would say, yeah, I know all about that. My children went to that school. Or I'd ask them a question, and they'd say, oh, you know all about that. Why are you asking about that? So if you're an Indigenous researcher, it's particularly important to make the familiar strange because otherwise it becomes overshadowed by your own sort of common understandings. And this is important not just if you're an Indigenous researcher, as in you've lived in that area or worked in that organisation, but even when we do the literature review. When we do a literature review, we make decisions about what's important and the questions we think we should ask participants. But when we go in with set questions, sometimes these aren't the important things for the communities that we work with. And when you bring in creative methods, you can sometimes widen that out so that it's not just based on the questions you asked, but the things that participants want to bring to those conversations. So back when I did my PhD, I asked people to take photographs and to make collages and to make hand-drawn maps of their everyday lives and experiences. So there was this process of making the familiar strange, but also these processes of defamiliarization. So that picture with the moon and the stars, that was brought in as part of a larger map by one of the participants. And when they talked about that drawing, they said, you probably would have asked me about college and about other things, a whole list of other things, but you probably wouldn't have asked me about the way I feel about the night. And I wouldn't have, because if I'd have done an interview schedule, that wouldn't have been sort of one of my questions. And then the participant talks a lot about how she feels that psychologically this is the place she escapes to. So where she was living, there was a lot of drug dealing going on around her house. She was a mature student that had gone back into education, but her family weren't really pleased with that decision and didn't think it was for people like them. So there are all these sort of conflicts going on, but she felt that the nighttime gave her that space to escape, but also to connect with loved ones that she'd lost. The picture in the middle, that was part of a collage by a 15-year-old girl called Susie. And she said, I wasn't looking for a picture of a prison, but when I saw this picture, I realised what a prisoner I am in my own house. So she will have known that. She wouldn't have just realised it in that moment. But sometimes when you do an interview, people are so sort of busy and want to give a quick response. You don't have time to think about what your life's about. But if you've got a lot of time to make a collage and think about this, sort of new things emerge. So that's sort of what she said. I didn't realise what a prisoner I was in my own home. And there were issues in that family of her siblings being able to go out, her brothers, but her being shipped everywhere and having no freedom. And then the picture of the two children, when I looked at these, I assumed they looked like this because one's slightly older than the other. But the mother who created this picture said, when I came to put my daughters in, I deliberately drew them like that because I realised how much one daughter's taken all my attention and how much my other daughter's being pushed into the background. So again, I'm not saying that she just knew that when she drew the picture, but having that time to reflect is a really important element of visual research. The other thing that I find important in my work is that I always do an interview around what participants make. So whether we're making things together in situ or whether participants are making things at home and I meet them later, I always use an interview to get an understanding of what participants intended in their images. So auteur theory is used in sort of art studies, and it's putting the importance on what the creator intended. So I think creative methods are really useful, but I think the usefulness of them is the conversations that surround them, so we can find out more. I'm going to talk through some studies where I've used different creative methods. And I think you don't always have to do something really complicated. So artifacts or everyday things tell us a lot about our lives. So we see that in archaeology. So archaeologists are interested in that cap or that piece of clothing or that buckle or that belt. So all these little things tell us something. And Rachel Hurdley's done studies of mantelpieces and areas in the home where we display things. So we invest in these everyday artifacts and they have meaning for us. So in this study, we worked with mothers who just had a baby. So we didn't want to say, okay, just had a baby, can you make me a collage and a map of your life and then do all these sort of things because they're busy and they're tired. So we thought we'd just ask people to bring objects. So that's got a lot less time commitment from participants, but at the same time, those objects contain meaning for participants. So that was really useful. So some participants draw objects and we discussed them in one room. Sometimes there was a sort of tour of the houses when they wanted to show us different things in different spaces. So we really got a sense of how the house was set up and the relationship in the family. And people brought things, this was about infant feeding. So people brought things you'd expect, like breast pumps and bottles and shawls. And they talked a lot about the sort of stigma around infant feeding. And if you breastfeed, then mothers were saying, you know, if I'm in the park, people are staring at me like I'm a pole dancer and there's sort of nowhere inside to go. If you bottle feed, it's like you're giving your baby cocaine. How dare you bottle feed? So they're in this sort of moral maze of motherhood. What they also did, though, was bring objects that weren't really connected with infant feeding, but things that they thought were important for their story. So there's a picture of 2 cups, and a mother brought those to talk about when she was pregnant. So it was a study with mothers and grandmothers, new mothers and new grandmothers. So the mother and the grandmother had gone out to have this lovely cream sort of afternoon tea in a posh hotel together. And she said, as soon as I went into the restaurant and they saw my pregnant stomach, they said, you won't be able to have the salmon, you won't be able to have the cream cheese, and neither of you can have them in case you swap food. So there was this instant sort of policing of the pregnant body, which then led us on to do different research because mothers felt it's not just the point of infant feeding, which is an issue, but as soon as you get pregnant, people make judgments about you. So objects were great, but you need to be prepared that not all participants will bring objects. So you still need a sort of backup, and we still have always a loose sort of interview schedule. But with one of the participants, they didn't bring anything, and it sort of puts the research on the back foot if everyone's been bringing them. So you always need to be prepared that not everyone wants to do the plan of bringing something creative or doing something creative or bringing an object that you had in mind. After this study, we started thinking more about motherhood more generally and sort of stigma in class and that moral maze of motherhood. And as part of this study, we thought about how our mothers sort of represented if you do different online searches. So if you put mother and baby into Google, you get all these sort of advertising images. So sanitized images when only the mother and child exist. There's nothing else in the background because the relationship's centralized. People look calm and people look happy, and mothers are close to their baby and glowing. When you put in teenage or young mother, or you put council estate, mother and baby, you get a whole load of different stigmatizing images which suggest otherhood rather than motherhood. So we looked at the ways in which mothers were represented, and we also worked with mothers, and they recognised the ways in which photographs tried to classify mothers like them. They recognised that the sort of advertising images and these sort of perfect images had no relation to everyday motherings because it's never sort of perfect, you're never glowing, it's never always like that with nothing in the background. But they argued that these were the expectations of mothers that couldn't be reached. So in that study, it was about using found images, but also about discussing these found images as part of the project with mothers. In this study, again, with mothers, we used different methods. So we used possible selves. So we were interested in how mothers saw their lives and who they wanted to be. We were also interested in their histories. So we asked mothers to create timelines of their lives from being a child right up to becoming a mother. And then we asked them to annotate these with emotion stickers. I really like emotion stickers because it enables participants to flag up the emotions they're happy to talk about. So often if you get interviewed, people say, and how did you feel about that? And how did you feel about that? And tell me more about how you felt about that. But when those sort of stickers are there, participants have already decided the emotions that they want to discuss around different points in their lives. We also had bubble activities, and we used collage. And that was sort of the stage one of the project. And then we met mothers and we did sandboxing. So we asked mothers to create experiences about their the representations of their experience around motherhood in this box filled with sand with about 200 little figures. And we did that jointly. So we reflected on our experiences of motherhood as researchers, and the participants reflected on their own experiences, and we could ask each other about what was in our sandboxes. So that was, for me, that was a sort of longer memory path. So my children are all grown up and I've got 5 grandchildren, but I could still remember my motherhood. For some mothers, it was quite new. So we discussed what was in the box. And what was really useful then was having that biographical information. So one of the mothers didn't want to use anything in their box. So they didn't put anything inside their box, but instead they just wrote one word, which was complete. Which sort of looks like, oh, they didn't want to engage. But with the biography of the mother, they'd lost several children and they'd been in quite difficult relationships. So when they finally had their child, complete was enough for that mother to say. So it's very poignant for that mother. In the picture you've got on the screen, there's some lions and tigers. And mothers talked about having to protect their children and not wanting them to be bullied. And then when you go back to the timelines, there's a lot about their own bullying and their own issues. So you can see how their whole sort of life stories reflect into their mothering practices and thoughts about their children's own futures. So there are lots of different ways of asking research questions. And a lot of the work that I do, so we're talking about studies with mothers, and I've done studies with parents and young parents. I also do a lot of work with children and young people who are care experienced, and then it's really important for me to try and move away from the social worker sort of interview style. So children and young people who've been in care are interviewed on a regular basis by practitioners and professionals and asked to talk about their lives. So what we did in this study, we had all-day events of activities. So we had T-shirt making, modelling, bag making, jewellery making, superstar sports, wall climbing with some older children. So we had all these like fun activity days, and children could come, and if they wanted to be involved in parts of the research, they could peg their name on a washing line, and if they didn't want to, they didn't. They could still come for the days, and some children came for more than one day because they really enjoyed being with other people who were care experienced. If they wanted to be involved, they used things like emotion stickers and maps and sandboxing. And they could also just do an interview, so they had choice about how they engaged. With older young people, we trained researchers. So in Cardiff University, we've got something called Cascade Voices. And for a long time now, we've worked with this group with Voices from Care. So different young people come in and out, but some young people are there for years. And we train them in research methods. So they're not just experts by experience of being in care, but have some knowledge and expertise in research methods. So they help us design studies, they act as co-researchers, they help with dissemination, they help people plan new funding bids and say what's needed. So they acted as co-researchers, led the focus groups and informed outputs from the research. You can also do remote methods. I like super used to working in person. So I was like, when it was COVID, I was like, oh no, it's not gonna work out. I can't be creative online. But yeah, I was also quite uncomfortable about doing research in COVID because it was a stressful time for everyone. But there are some great studies. So that COVID reality studies isn't mine, that's someone else's, but that's worth looking at. So they did lots and lots of interesting work with families in COVID. I did some studies in COVID. So the first one was from Voices from Care. So the young people in Voices from Care said they wanted research done to document the issues that they were facing in COVID. And some of them we talked to by phone or online, and they created things. Some people wrote poetry. One person created the model that you can see there about how COVID was overshadowing their community. So it was important to work with young people in different ways that they felt comfortable with and to record their experiences of COVID in terms of policy change and advice. I also did another lovely project in COVID working with children, which we were going to do in all day sort of activity days. But because of COVID, we had to do remotely. So instead of just us working with the children did this from home with their foster carers. So we sent lots of different materials out. So they made different cups and they painted stones and they built cars and the whole project was about how children like to work. So it wasn't about generating data on a topic. It was like, what do children like? So we had this sort of children's advisory panel and the foster carers telling us what worked, what didn't, what was rubbish, what adjustments we needed, that you need finer pens if you want to make a Minecraft stone because the paints don't work. So it's really, really useful to think about what works with creative methods, what doesn't work. My favourite thing about the project, though, was that it had this sort of side benefit. So we weren't going to involve foster carers. We were just going to work with children. But foster carers said that they learned a lot about children, particularly if they just started fostering children. So they asked the fostering network if they can always do these sort of activities when they have a new child that comes to live with them. And as a result, the fostering network has made a sort of pack of different creative activities so that foster carers and children can get to know each other. So with methods, there's always this idea of suitability. So sometimes drawing can be seen as childish. People are worried about their artistic ability. You can't make people do your participatory method. When I started doing it, I really like drawing. Not all participants want to draw. So you need a sort of suite of methods. So do people want to draw, collage, use photo elicitation? And you also need to try and test things yourselves. So you should never really go out in the field unless you've tried different methods. So no method is perfect. Sandboxing, the first sandboxing set I had, we made from bits and bobs in our own homes and children's toys. But the kits you buy are very gendered. You can see there that someone's stuck a sword to that figure with plasticine, which they got off a male soldier. There's also issues with diversity and disability in the figure sets. And when you try and supplement, they're different sizes. So it's thinking about what is in your set, how it can connect with other people. I was also put that fuzzy felt picturing, so I do use fuzzy felts. If you ever use fuzzy felts, you have to pop them all out individually. So I bought some new boxes to work with people and I forgot that you have to pop them all out, which takes ages. So always, always test your projects. Alone or together. So I used in early research, participants have done things at home, and I thought I'd be stepping out as a researcher and giving them some space. But there are always people in the home who might influence research. So in those pictures there, that was drawn by a child in the research. Then one of their parents sort of took over on the second part. So when we had the collage, the child said, I don't even watch Top Gear. She had all these sort of pictures in that she wouldn't have chosen. So you can have the researcher present, observing, a joint activity when you make things together. So there are pros and cons to these different approaches. It's been taking too much time. I need to speak faster. So ethical principles in research, you'll all be familiar with anonymization, confidentiality, avoidance of harm, but These can be heightened and different when we use creative and visual materials. So there are arguments about if we need to look as well as see. Do we need to see images? Do we need to see images of participants? Is that safe? I think once visual images go into the public realm, we lose control of them, which can be a big issue. So earlier I talked about documentary photography. Florence Thompson in this image, migrant mother. After the photo was taken by Dorothea Lang, it sort of went viral in those days. It was published in lots and lots of newspapers, and she wanted it taken down. She didn't want to be fixed in that trope of mother in poverty. So there's that time immemorial aspect and this idea that people who are photographed might change their mind. So anonymity is complicated because some participants want to be seen. Often when you work with children, they want everyone to see what they've made, or they want to get messages out and they want to be central in it. So Paul Sweetman's worked in this way and thought about the ethics of recognition. So arguing there shouldn't be this anonymity. People feel empowered when they're seen. So in this project in Southampton, there was these sort of huge sort of installations and things in the museum telling people stories, and they felt that belonging and community involvement, so they wanted to be seen. But this approach isn't suitable for all types of research. So when you're researching in sensitive topics, you have to think really carefully about who's seen. And images can't speak, so sometimes we'll say I'm including images in a presentation because I'm giving participants a voice, but it's the researcher's voice that gives the presentation, not the participants. So we can think about, should we use images at all? If we do use images, should they be disguised? Can they be disguised ethically? I can't see the chat now, but if you want to have a go in the chat, we can think about, do these disguises work? So I'll have a look at the chat later and see if anyone guessed who the three art figures were. So I won't tell you now, maybe I'll tell you in the Q&A if it's not in the chat. So even if we pixelate the face of the first one, we can still recognize that artwork. And pixelation is dangerous because it evokes this idea of criminalization. We probably all know who the person in the middle is. Even without their head, you might recognize that famous statue. The other ones at the bottom, the person in the yellow shirt isn't a famous person, but if you worked in their office, you would know who that is. So pixelating, putting funny faces on, smiley faces over children's heads. It might stigmatize participants, make them look foolish, and disguises don't always work. So I've seen pixelated photographs of a mother and child, and then above them, they've got the name of the community centre that they go to. So you've got to be really careful when you think about visual images. I don't know if I've got time to tell this story. This is a story of Sampath. It's literature, it's not an academic book. He works in a post office. He's lazy in work, he doesn't get his work done. He argues a lot with his parents at home. One day he gets sacked, and then he goes home and his parents tell him off, and he goes to live in a guava tree. And people are interested, they come to see him, and he starts to tell them all these things about their lives, all these sort of secrets they thought no one in the village knew. So they thought that Sampath had this sort of special power. But Sampath didn't have a special power. When he worked in the post office, when he was being lazy, he used to read everyone's mail. So he knew all these stories that they were going to tell to other people outside the village, but not just stories about themselves, but all the characters that they talked about. And when I read this book, I thought that's just like the social researcher, because when people tell us their stories, they tell us about their fathers, their mothers, their lovers, their sisters. And if we make them visible in our research outputs, we make all those people they talked about visible too. So there's a lot to think about with ethical research and recognition. And it's not a one size fits all, but it's just about our own thoughtful practice rather than necessarily a strict ethical code. Informed consent is also really important. Often I think consent is uninformed because people we work with don't know what a journal article is or a conference. In previous studies, I have brought people in for part of a conference to show them how I talk about them. So informed consent is easy if you're working with people who've been to university or in academia, but often consent isn't informed in the way it should be. So there's some lovely, people can have the slides later because I haven't got really time to go into all this, but there's some lovely tools that you can use, like Vicky Timperley's Case of Ethics, to actually have a proper conversation about ethics and get things out, like a voice changer to show that how the researcher changes your voice. And Lucy Robinson's recently done a research ethics tree, which is based on Vicky's work. Somebody, another Lucy, is working with refugee and asylum seekers and doesn't want to use a case, but has built another visual form. So it's important sometimes to think about ethics and ensure that people really do know what we're doing and what they're consenting for. The other thing I'm going to whiz through very quickly, what happens next? So when I do research, particularly with care experience, young people, they'll say, people like you have been before, nothing ever changes. So you're sort of just like the research vampire, you're going in, you're getting this information, you're writing it in academic journals that not everyone can access. It can be in language which is difficult. So, you know, how do we move beyond the academic article and inform policy and practice and try and make changes with the research that participants have generously given their time to? So there are lots of lovely projects that communities communicate stories in different ways. So Catherine Carroll's done some lovely work around mothers whose children have died and they donate breast milk, writing letters between the two because they're not allowed to speak to each other. Michael Richardson's done a play, E.J. Reynolds done Engender, Laura Shabai has done some lovely work representing participants with their photographs without them being recognisable, but not blurring or pixelated. Peter Marsh has made some lovely models of how people experience arthritis. So there's lots and lots of ways of communicating stories. And in my own work, I've used posters and postcards, films, music videos, a whole load of different things, magazines that went to every foster care in Wales, magazines that went to every young person in Wales in a style that they could engage with. And where people have got in touch and said, you know, I've been to the school and said, I don't want my children being pulled out of class by their social worker or other things. It's not come from the academic articles. It's come off the back of the film or the poster. So there are lots of ways that we can use the visual without having participants' faces or voices. It's always a revisualization and a reframing, but they can be useful in informing policy and practice. We didn't have time for analysis. I knew we wouldn't. I edited this book with Helen and Ali. It's only in hardback at the moment, but it's something for libraries to order. So if you get it in for your library, that speaks a lot about creative ways of analysis. So using poetry, using an evidence wall, using different things, using word clouds. So in editing this book, I learned a lot about creative analysis. So my analysis is probably the least creative part of my work, but now there's lots and lots of ideas in there for people interested in creative analysis. So diolch yn fawr. Thank you for listening. I'm assuming you've all got access to the slides, so I'll just stop share. Diolch.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Dawn, for that presentation. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I can see the appreciation coming through already through the React features on Zoom. So, yeah, I think perhaps we can go into questions. I can't see any questions in the chat. So perhaps if anyone has any questions that they'd like to maybe put their hand up and speak to, please feel free.
I was hoping someone identified my pictures in the chat, but no one knew.
No one knew. Yeah, I know that at least one was this is testing my art history knowledge. Like one was, that was of course the Mona Lisa, you
Yeah.
know. Does anyone else want to jump in? Otherwise, I may just like list off Michelangelo's David.
Yes.
I know there was a few anonymous ones, but there's also the Venus.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well
yeah,
done, Daniel.
a few of those. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll pat myself on the back. Perhaps I can start off with a question, my own question, and then if anyone has any questions, yeah, please do jump in or raise your hand. I was interested in sort of the conversation, the point you raised about anonymity and also people's desire to sort of be recognized for their work. So I was just wondering if you could share more thoughts on how to balance that need for sort of like often in the research process for people to be anonymized with participant desire for visibility and potential. Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's such a tricky one. So there's on the slides there's a paper by Geraldine Vaughan and Geraldine Brady, and they did some really lovely work with young parents. And young parents were very keen to be seen because they wanted to speak back to that stigmatizing discourse about being a young parent, and they were featured in a lot of the literature. And it was useful because it had an impact on local policy and practice, and the mothers were pleased to be involved. But then in retrospect, they just thought about that idea of time immemorial. So people can be very keen to participate, but then if 5 years later they're getting a job, or 10 years later, or 20 years later, and they're not the mother but the grandmother, do they always want to be known, you know, as the young mother or as the teenage mother? So once something goes out there, you can't take it back. And I think that's difficult because often people want to be seen in that moment. I've also seen other sort of practices where parents are keen to make videos, or not necessarily in research, but for organisations that have helped them. So they sort of feel indebted to that organisation. They want to help them. And I've seen videos where people talk about sort of drug addiction, and then their service has helped them, and their other children got removed, but they've managed to keep one of their children, and they're so grateful for the service. But there's an idea of like, where does that go? And what does that mean for people who might know that mother or know her children? So I think it's very, very tricky. And for me, I don't use photographs for that reason. But you do have to negotiate that with people who want to be seen. I think maybe if I worked in different areas, I would be less cautious. But I think you can creatively revisualize things and work with participants to make outputs which don't feature them, but feature something they think tells their story.
Mhm. Yeah, so maybe sort of because another question I had noted down was expanding on the examples that you gave on how you the revisualizations you did in your work. I know you put some examples in your slides. So I was wondering if you could just expand on maybe one of those examples, just to really hit home what that looks like from your perspective.
Yeah, so we use like posters and postcards. So a lot of the posters got put up in like social service sort of offices, because children talked a lot about sort of the lack. So looked after children, children in need gets children to sin. So you get that sort of discourse. I've got a lack at 2 o'clock and then I've got a sin at 4. And young people hate that sort of, you know, terminology. So sort of reminding people that's it's not a number, it's not a lack, it is a person. And other things about aspiration. So the posters were useful. We had someone made a rap song, and then they did a live performance, and we worked with people in youth offending teams were there, and they sort of said there was a bit about being taken out of class, which is also a huge issue. So lots and lots of research have said don't take children out of live lessons to see their social worker, but secretaries still come into a classroom and say, your social worker's here, Daniel, please come out, you know. So it's hugely stigmatizing and disruptive. So that was in some of the lines of the song. And then after, some of the teams were saying, like, we've just been doing that. We've been doing that for 40 years. So we take children out as well. And like, it's not purposeful. They didn't realise, but sort of hearing it in that context made them really think about the impacts. So I think it's just different. It's a different way to connect with people and get those stories about. I think Rhiannon has a hand up.
Yeah, Rhiannon, did you want to come in?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Dawn, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank
My
you.
alarm's going. I did some work for an NIHR fellowship looking at gang involved kids, and as part of that, kind of during the interviews, I got them to draw little kind of portraits of me, and I drew portraits of them, and it felt like a kind of mad thing to do. It took a real leap of faith, I think, both for them and me to ask them to do it. And yet there was something, and of course, as you say, not everyone wants
Yeah.
to do things like that. And you actually absolutely have to give them the choice. But I was kind of amazed that the majority did do it, and they really entered into it and really enjoyed it. And there was something very, I guess, kind of leveling, democratizing about that process, because I can't draw, and and that somehow was reassuring to them. But it was a laugh, it was funny, and I think finding things that are enjoyable is such a good thing. And yet there is a real leap of faith, I think, involved on both parts, I guess. I don't know if you've got anything kind of to say to that, but anyway, thank you. I was really fascinated. I thought I'd just say something.
Ah, thanks, Rhiannon. Yeah, it is difficult because but it is useful when you're willing to do it, and that's what I was sort of saying earlier. You've got to be willing to do things yourself. So if you just go in and ask people to draw, but you're not willing to draw, and I'm not very good at drawing. I do love drawing because I don't care that I'm not any good anymore because I've been doing it a while. But yeah, it is leveling because with the sort of, you're talking about the sort of drawings, so it's like how they see you and how you see them and how you represent each other. And even other aspects. So I was talking about earlier doing the joint sandboxing with the mothers about my mothering experience, their mothering experience. I've also done joint sandboxing with children and young people in care. So I think it's being willing to share. So it's not just them, you asking all the questions, they telling you what, that them feeling that they can ask you questions too. So I think that's a really lovely example of drawing each other in the interview. And I suppose they can also be used for pre-tasks as well. So it doesn't always have to be about generating data. So sometimes people use these sort of activities as a getting to know you before you even move to generating data. So I think creative activities are really nice just to establish that sort of time to get to know people before you delve into research.
Yeah, thank you, Rihanna, for that question.
Thank you.
I wonder if there are maybe a final question, if there's anyone else in the audience who'd like to ask a question. We'll just give it a moment in case anyone would like to jump in.
And wants to speak to me. Thank you, Rhiannon. I feel like I have a friend now.
If not, I have one last question, maybe like a final quick question before we round up. So also touching on this sandbox example you mentioned, as you're speaking, perhaps somebody sort of found their own way to engage in that activity. So the question being, in cases where participants may be hesitant or unable to engage with creative methods, how do you have any reflections on how you can adapt, how to adapt your approach to engagement?
Yeah. So I've always now, I haven't always, I've gone in with my method, so I'm not pretending, it's perfect. I've gone in and just wanted people to do it, and then when they keep like saying, can we do it on a different day, not getting the hint. So through my practice, I've realised that people don't always like to do particular things. I think sandboxing is quite nice because there's no artistic skill needed. And there's no fine motor skill needed. You've just got the figures. Somebody even can set the figures up for you. So I think people feel less pressured than they do in a drawing activity. But if people don't want to do an activity, we have a chat. So I do an interview, but it is in a sort of chatty style on themes. So where people don't want to do creative methods, I try and do an interview that still enables participants to take things in quite a wide scope, to try and get it over them to tell their story or think about what's important, or start with the more generalized about what's important for other people, or that topic more broadly. So I don't push it. I don't push it with the creative methods. I do, though, do things that can help to interest people, not always just in research, but in teaching as well. And I've done meetings with government agencies and took drawing in, so they engage. So pens that smell nice, I think work really well. So you can get pens that smell like strawberry and pineapple. So if people start taking the lids off and smelling the pens, they're more interested in the pens. Blank sheets are really difficult. So I'll take in stamp letters so people can make words, stickers, lots of packs of stickers so people can annotate in that way. So I think it's just about having options and really importantly, trialing things. So I used to trial things like with my own children, I trial things with my grandchildren. My grandchildren have actually been farmed out to different research projects to try methods. So try with people, try on yourself, try with people you know, try with people in those age groups, and potentially try with communities that you're going to research with and get a real good understanding of the different reactions. I think as well, when people are neurodiverse, you need to be careful with things. So I was talking about fuzzy felts. Some people don't like the feeling of the fuzzy felt. So it's having options, having a bag of stuff that if one thing doesn't work, you can just switch to another thing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dawn. I think on that note, we are out of time. So I'll just say a massive thank you again for your time, Dawn, and for your presentation. I think if it's okay with you, we can share the slides.
Yeah, that's fine.
Afterwards.
And thanks for my nice messages in the box. So thanks Danielle, thanks Susan, thanks Chloe for inviting me, and thanks everyone else.
No, thank you. So we'll be in touch again for the remainder of the series. Chloe Chloe, who has been facilitating the series, will be in touch about what comes next. But for now, thank you for joining us, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon. So thank you. Thank you, Dawn.